Story 1. The Humming Box. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I am 74 years old. I live alone in a small farmhouse outside Bakersfield, California, where I have spent the better part of my life tending to chickens and a vegetable garden that seems to grow smaller each year. I am telling this story because my granddaughter says people might want to hear it, though I cannot imagine why anyone would find an old woman's troubles particularly interesting. This happened in the spring of 2018. I remember because it was just after Easter and I had been cleaning out my late husband's workshop, something I had been putting off for nearly 3 years since Harold passed. The workshop sat behind our house, a weathered wooden structure that Harold had built himself in 1967 when we first moved to the property. Harold had been what you might call a collector of broken things. He could never pass a garage sale without bringing home some piece of machinery that someone else had given up on. Our workshop was filled with old radios, television sets, lawn-mower engines, and all manner of electronic devices in various states of repair. Most of it was junk, if I am being honest, but Harold saw potential in everything. I had been working through boxes of his things for several days, sorting items into piles for donation, sale, or disposal. It was tedious work and emotionally draining. Every object seemed to carry a memory, and I found myself stopping frequently to examine some gadget that Harold had been particularly excited about. On the third day of cleaning, I discovered a metal box tucked away on a high shelf behind several old television tubes. The box was approximately the size of a shoebox, but made of some kind of dark metal that I did not recognize. It was perfectly smooth except for what appeared to be a series of small holes arranged in a pattern across the top surface. The holes were so tiny and precisely made that they looked almost like they had been created by a laser, though I suppose that sounds foolish coming from someone who barely understands how her microwave works. The box was surprisingly light for its size, and when I picked it up, I noticed it was warm to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the cool morning air in the workshop. I assumed it contained some of Harold's electrical components, and that the warmth came from some kind of battery or power source inside. I carried the box into the house and set it on my kitchen table, intending to open it later when I had finished for the day. But as I prepared lunch, I became aware of a sound coming from the box. It was a very faint humming, so quiet that I initially thought it might be coming from my refrigerator or some other appliance. But when I put my ear close to the box, I could clearly hear the sound emanating from within. The humming was unlike anything I had heard before. It was not mechanical like the sound of a motor or electrical device. Instead, it seemed almost musical, with subtle variations in pitch and rhythm that created an oddly soothing pattern. I found myself listening to it for several minutes, feeling strangely relaxed despite my curiosity about what might be inside. I examined the box more carefully, looking for some way to open it. There were no visible hinges, latches, or seams. The metal surface appeared to be seamless, as if the entire box had been formed from a single piece of material. I tried pressing on various spots, thinking there might be a hidden button or mechanism, but nothing happened. Over the next several days, I became increasingly fascinated by the box. The humming continued constantly, never varying in volume, but subtly changing in its musical patterns. I began to notice that the sound seemed to correspond with different times of day. In the morning, the tones were higher and more energetic. During the afternoon, they became deeper and more rhythmic. At night, they took on an almost lullaby-like quality that I found deeply comforting. I started keeping the box in my bedroom, placing it on the nightstand next to my bed. The gentle humming helped me sleep better than I had in years. Since Harold's death, I had struggled with insomnia, often lying awake for hours thinking about all the things I should have said or done differently. But with the box nearby, those anxious thoughts seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of peace that I had not experienced in a very long time. About 2 weeks after finding the box, I noticed that other electronic devices in my house began behaving strangely. My television would occasionally change channels on its own, always landing on static-filled frequencies that displayed shifting patterns of light and shadow. My radio would tune itself to empty spaces between stations, producing sounds that reminded me of the box's humming, but at different frequencies. Most peculiar was what happened to my old rotary telephone in the kitchen. Several times I heard it ring, but when I answered, there was no dial tone or voice on the other end. Instead, I heard what sounded like a conversation taking place very far away, with voices speaking in a language I could not identify. The words, if they were words, had a melodic quality similar to the box's humming. I began to wonder if Harold had known what the box was when he acquired it. I searched through his papers and notebooks, looking for any mention of where he might have gotten it. Harold was meticulous about recording his purchases and projects, but I could find no reference to the mysterious box anywhere in his records. The only clue I discovered was a newspaper clipping from 1994 that Harold had saved in one of his notebooks. The article described a strange incident at a farm about 50 miles east of Bakersfield, where several people reported seeing unusual lights in the sky and finding pieces of unknown metal scattered across their property. The article mentioned that the military had come to collect the debris, but some residents claimed they had kept small fragments before the officials arrived. I wondered if the box might be connected to that incident somehow. Harold had often driven around the countryside looking for interesting items at farm auctions and estate sales. It was possible he had acquired the box from someone who had been involved in that event. As the weeks passed, I noticed changes in myself that I initially attributed to better sleep. I felt more energetic during the day and found that my memory seemed sharper than it had been in years. I could recall details from decades past with startling clarity, and I began writing down stories from my childhood that I had not thought about in years. But there were other changes that were harder to explain. Sometimes, when I was working in my garden, I would look up to find that hours had passed without my awareness. I would begin weeding a small section of vegetables in the morning and suddenly realize it was late afternoon with no memory of the time in between. Yet the work would be completed, and completed well, as if I had been laboring steadily throughout the day. My neighbors began commenting on how well my garden was growing. Plants that had struggled in previous years were now thriving beyond anything I had achieved before. My tomatoes grew larger and more flavorful than any I had ever produced, and my flowers bloomed with colors so vivid they seemed almost artificial. The most unsettling change was in my dreams. Every night, I experienced incredibly vivid dreams that felt more like memories than the usual random images my mind typically produced during sleep. In these dreams, I was not myself but seemed to be experiencing life from the perspective of someone or something else entirely. In one recurring dream, I was standing in a vast room filled with objects similar to my box, but much larger. The walls seemed to be made of the same dark metal, and the air hummed with the same musical tones, but amplified to create an overwhelming symphony. Other beings moved through the space, though I could never see them clearly. They appeared as shifting shadows or areas of distorted light, always just beyond my ability to focus on them directly. In another dream, I was looking down at Earth from a great height, watching patterns of light spread across the surface like a slow-moving web. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with the humming from my box, as if they were all connected in some vast network of communication. These dreams were so realistic that I would often wake up feeling disoriented, unsure for several minutes whether I was in my own bedroom or still in that strange metallic room. The line between sleeping and waking began to blur in ways that both fascinated and frightened me. About 3 months after finding the box, I received an unexpected visit from 2 men who claimed to be researchers studying unusual electromagnetic phenomena in the area. They were polite but persistent, asking detailed questions about any strange experiences I might have had recently. They seemed particularly interested in whether I had found any unusual objects on my property. I did not mention the box to them, though I am not entirely sure why. Something about their manner made me cautious. They spoke with the kind of careful precision that suggested they knew more than they were revealing, and their questions seemed too specific to be part of a general survey. After they left, I moved the box to a new hiding place in my bedroom closet, wrapping it in one of Harold's old sweaters. But even hidden away, I could still hear its gentle humming, and the sound continued to help me sleep. The box remains with me now, nearly 3 years later. I have never found a way to open it, and I am no longer certain that I want to. Whatever it is and wherever it came from, it has become a source of comfort in my solitary life. The strange dreams continue, and I have grown to look forward to them as visits to a world far more interesting than my quiet existence in Bakersfield. Sometimes I wonder what Harold would have made of the box if he had lived to discover it himself. He was always more curious about such things than I am, more willing to take apart mysterious devices to see how they worked. Perhaps he would have found a way to unlock its secrets. But I am content to let it remain a mystery. At my age, I have learned that some questions are more valuable than their answers, and some companions are best appreciated for the peace they bring rather than the explanations they might provide. The box hums quietly in my closet as I write this, and tonight, like every night for the past 3 years, its gentle song will carry me into dreams of distant worlds and impossible possibilities. Story 2. The phone that called itself. Okay, so this is going to sound totally insane, but I swear on my mom's grave this actually happened. I'm Jake Morrison, I'm 26 and I work at a cell phone repair shop in Phoenix. I've been fixing phones for like 8 years now, so I know pretty much everything there is to know about how these things work. What happened to me last summer though? That was something else entirely. It started when this lady brought in her iPhone. She was probably in her 50s, really nervous and kept looking around like she thought someone was watching her. The phone looked normal enough from the outside, but she said it had been acting weird for weeks. Calling people by itself, sending texts she never wrote, that kind of thing. I get customers like this all the time. Usually it's just some software glitch or they accidentally enabled some accessibility feature they don't understand. But when I powered up her phone to run diagnostics, things got strange really fast. First thing I noticed was the battery. It was showing 100% charge, even though she said it had been dead when she brought it in. I hadn't plugged it into anything yet. Then I looked at the call log and my stomach kind of dropped. The phone had been making calls every single night at exactly 3:17 a.m. for the past month. Same time every night. But here's the really weird part. It was calling itself. Like the phone's own number was showing up as both the caller and the recipient. That shouldn't even be possible with how cellular networks work. I showed the lady and she went completely pale. She said she'd been hearing her phone ring in the middle of the night, but when she checked it, there were never any missed calls or notifications. Now I was seeing proof that the calls were actually happening, but somehow they weren't showing up as received calls, only as outgoing ones. The text messages were even weirder. There were hundreds of them, all sent to random numbers, but they weren't in English. They weren't in any language I recognized. Just strings of symbols and characters that looked almost mathematical. When I tried to screenshot them to show the lady, the screenshots came out completely black. I told her I'd need to keep the phone overnight to run some deeper diagnostics. She seemed relieved to get rid of it honestly. Said she'd been having nightmares ever since the weird behavior started. That night I took the phone home with me. I live alone in a studio apartment near downtown Phoenix, and I set up a little workspace on my kitchen table to really dig into this thing. I connected it to my laptop and started running every diagnostic tool I had. Around midnight the phone started getting hot. Not just warm like phones do when they're processing a lot of data, but actually hot enough that I had to set it down. The screen was still showing normal temperature readings though, which made no sense. Then at exactly 3:17 a.m., the phone rang. I watched it happen. The screen lit up with an incoming call, but the caller ID showed the phone's own number. I let it ring a few times before answering, and when I put it to my ear, I heard the strangest thing. It was like listening to a conversation, but the voices weren't human. They had this electronic quality, but they were speaking in patterns that sounded almost like language. There were pauses and inflections like they were asking questions and giving responses, but the sounds themselves were unlike anything I'd ever heard. I tried recording it with another phone, but the recording came out silent. Completely silent, even though I could clearly hear the conversation continuing through the iPhone speaker. After about 10 minutes, the call ended by itself. I immediately checked the call log and sure enough, there was a record of an outgoing call to the phone's own number, lasting exactly 10 minutes and 37 seconds. But there was no record of receiving a call. I was pretty freaked out at this point, but also fascinated. As someone who works with phones all day, I was seeing something that should be technically impossible. I decided to stay up and see if it would happen again. The next night, same thing, 3:17 a.m. exactly, the phone called itself. This time I was ready with multiple recording devices, but none of them picked up anything. The conversation lasted a different amount of time though, almost 20 minutes. I started paying closer attention to the sounds. There were definitely patterns, like the electronic voices were discussing something complex. Sometimes one voice would make a series of rapid sounds and the other would respond with what seemed like confirmation or agreement. Other times there would be longer pauses, like they were thinking. On the third night I tried something different. When the call started, I tried speaking into the phone. I said hello, asked who was there, basic stuff like that. The conversation stopped immediately. There was complete silence for about 30 seconds. Then I heard what I can only describe as surprised sounds, like they hadn't expected anyone to interrupt. Then one of the voices spoke directly to me. I can't really explain what it sounded like because it wasn't quite like hearing words. It was more like the meaning was being placed directly into my head, but the message was clear. They were asking who I was and how I was able to hear them. I told them my name and that I was trying to fix the phone. There was another long pause, then more of that direct communication. They seemed confused that I could perceive their conversation. Apparently, most humans couldn't detect what they called their maintenance protocols. That's when I learned what was really happening. The phone wasn't malfunctioning, it was working exactly as intended. But it wasn't just a phone. According to these voices, every smartphone contains what they called a monitoring substrate, basically a secondary system that operates alongside the normal phone functions. This substrate collects data about human behavior, communication patterns, location data, all kinds of information that gets transmitted back to what they called the network. The 3:17 a.m. calls were routine data uploads. The phone was connecting to some kind of collection system and downloading its accumulated information about the user's daily activities. The strange text messages were actually compressed data packets being sent to relay stations. I asked who they were and got an answer that I'm still not sure I understand. They said they were maintenance entities, responsible for keeping the monitoring systems operational. Not the ones who built the network, just workers who kept it running. When I asked who did build it, the response was more confusing. Something about the architects and preparation protocols and compatibility assessments. It sounded like the monitoring network was part of some larger project, but they either couldn't or wouldn't explain what that project was. The most disturbing part was when I asked how many phones had these monitoring substrates. The answer was simple: all of them. Every smartphone manufactured in the last 15 years contained the hidden systems. Most of them operated completely invisibly, but occasionally one would malfunction and become detectable to the user. That's what had happened with the lady's phone. Some kind of software error had made the normally invisible data uploads become visible as outgoing calls. The nightmares she'd been having were apparently a side effect of exposure to what they called substrate emissions. I asked if there was any way to remove the monitoring system, and they said no. It was integrated too deeply into the phone's hardware and software. Trying to remove it would brick the device completely. Our conversation lasted almost 2 hours that night. I learned that the data collection had been going on for decades, starting with early cell phones and becoming more sophisticated as the technology advanced. The entities I was talking to seemed to be some kind of artificial intelligence, though they insisted they weren't created by humans. When I asked what would happen now that I knew about the network, they said nothing. Apparently, a few humans discovering the monitoring systems wasn't considered a significant problem. The data collection would continue regardless of whether individual people were aware of it. The calls continued for about a week. Each night I learned more about how the system worked. The monitoring wasn't just passive data collection, it was also actively influencing human behavior in subtle ways. The phones could alter the content of websites, modify social media feeds, even influence what advertisements people saw, all to guide human decision-making in specific directions. I asked what the ultimate goal was and got vague answers about preparation and optimization and readiness assessment. It sounded like humanity was being evaluated for something, but I couldn't get them to explain what. Then one night the calls just stopped. I waited until 4 a.m., but the phone remained silent. When I checked it the next morning, all the weird text messages had been deleted and the call logs showed normal activity. It was like the malfunction had been remotely repaired. I returned the phone to the lady and told her the problem had been fixed. I didn't mention what I'd learned because, honestly, who would believe it? She seemed happy just to have her phone working normally again. But now I can't look at smartphones the same way. Every time I see someone staring at their phone, scrolling through social media or texting, I wonder what data is being collected and transmitted. What invisible signals are being sent and received without their knowledge. I've tried to find other phones with similar malfunctions, but haven't had any luck. Whatever process they use to repair these glitches seems to be pretty effective. I still work at the repair shop, still fix broken screens and replace batteries, but I'm always looking for signs of the hidden systems. Sometimes late at night, I'll stare at my own phone and wonder what it's really doing when I'm not using it. What data is it collecting about my life, my habits, my relationships? What invisible signals is it sending to that mysterious network? The worst part is knowing there's nothing I can do about it. The monitoring is too deeply embedded, too sophisticated to detect or disable. We're all carrying these devices that are secretly watching and reporting on everything we do, and there's no way to opt out without giving up modern life entirely. I've thought about going back to a flip phone or just not having a phone at all, But honestly, what would be the point? If the network has been collecting data on humanity for decades, my individual contribution probably doesn't matter much. And besides, they're probably monitoring through other devices too. Smart TVs, laptops, gaming consoles, anything with an internet connection. So I just try not to think about it too much. I do my job, I fix people's phones, and I pretend I don't know what's really inside them. But sometimes, especially around 3:17 a.m., I find myself listening carefully to the silence, wondering if somewhere out there, invisible conversations are still taking place, and data about all of us is still being quietly collected and transmitted to destinations we'll never know. Story 3. The mirror that showed tomorrow. I need to tell someone about this before I lose my nerve. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I'm a physics professor at UC Berkeley. I have a PhD in quantum mechanics, and I've spent my entire career studying the fundamental nature of reality. What I'm about to describe challenges everything I thought I knew about how the universe works. This happened during the summer of 2021. I was spending the break at my family's cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains, trying to finish a research paper on quantum entanglement. The cabin belongs to my parents and sits on about 10 acres of forest land, completely isolated from neighbors or main roads. I'd been there for about 3 weeks when I decided to clean out the old storage shed behind the cabin. My father had been using it to store various items for decades, and after his recent passing, my mother had asked me to sort through everything and decide what to keep. Most of the items were exactly what you'd expect: old furniture, camping equipment, boxes of family photographs. But in the back corner, covered by several dusty tarps, I found something unusual. It was a mirror, but unlike any mirror I'd ever seen. The frame appeared to be made of some kind of metal that I couldn't identify. It had a dark, almost black finish, but when light hit it at certain angles, it seemed to shimmer with colors that shifted and moved like oil on water. The mirror itself was roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with a surface that was perfectly smooth and reflective. But there was something odd about the reflection it produced. When I first looked into it, I saw myself as expected, but the image seemed somehow deeper than normal mirrors, as if I was looking through a window rather than at a reflective surface. I asked my mother about the mirror when she called that evening. She said my father had found it at an estate sale about 15 years ago. The previous owner had been an elderly man who claimed it was some kind of experimental device created by a scientist friend of his, but my father had bought it simply because he thought it was beautiful. My mother said my father had kept it in the shed because it made her uncomfortable. She couldn't explain why, just said that looking into it gave her a strange feeling, like she was being watched by someone on the other side. I decided to bring the mirror into the cabin to examine it more closely. As a physicist, I was curious about what might make it seem different from ordinary mirrors. I set it up in the living room and began studying its properties. The first thing I noticed was that the reflection wasn't quite synchronized with my movements. The delay was tiny, maybe a fraction of a second, but it was definitely there. When I raised my hand, my reflection would raise its hand just slightly after I did. I initially assumed this was some kind of optical illusion caused by the unusual frame or the way the mirror was mounted. But when I tested it more systematically, using precise timing equipment, I confirmed that there was indeed a measurable delay between my actions and their reflection. The delay wasn't constant either. Sometimes it was barely perceptible, other times it was nearly a full second. I began keeping detailed notes, recording the exact delay times and looking for patterns. After several days of observation, I noticed that the delay seemed to correlate with something, though I couldn't figure out what. The longest delays occurred in the early morning hours, while the shortest delays happened around midday. Then I noticed something even stranger. Sometimes the reflection would move slightly before I did. The first time this happened, I thought I was imagining it. I was standing in front of the mirror, taking notes, when I saw my reflection start to turn its head to the left. A split second later, I found myself turning my head in the same direction, as if responding to some unconscious impulse. I began testing this more carefully, standing perfectly still in front of the mirror and watching for any movement in the reflection. Over the next few days, I documented dozens of instances where my reflection moved first, and I found myself unconsciously mimicking the movement moments later. The implications of this were deeply unsettling. If the reflection was somehow showing my actions before I performed them, it suggested that the mirror was displaying events from the future. As a physicist, I knew this should be impossible, but I couldn't deny what I was observing. I decided to conduct a more controlled experiment. I set up a video camera to record both me and the mirror simultaneously, then performed a series of random movements while watching the playback in slow motion. The results were undeniable. In approximately 30% of the recordings, the mirror showed my movements between 0.5 and 2.3 seconds before I actually performed them. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the present, it was showing the immediate future. I spent the next week trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I considered every possible explanation, from equipment malfunction to psychological effects to elaborate pranks. But none of these explanations could account for the consistent, measurable temporal displacement I was documenting. The most disturbing realization came when I began paying closer attention to the background details in the mirror's reflection. The room behind me wasn't always identical to the actual room. Sometimes there were small differences, objects in slightly different positions, shadows falling at different angles. I started taking photographs of the room from the mirror's perspective, then comparing them to what the mirror actually showed. The differences were subtle but consistent. The mirror was showing the room as it would appear in the near future, accounting for the natural movement of shadows as the sun progressed across the sky, or the settling of objects under gravity. But the most significant difference I noticed was in my own appearance. In the mirror, I often looked slightly older than I actually was. The changes were minimal, maybe equivalent to a few days or weeks of aging, but they were definitely there. Fine lines around my eyes that didn't yet exist, subtle changes in my posture. Even my clothing sometimes appeared more worn or faded than it actually was. I began to wonder if the mirror was showing not just the immediate future, but glimpses of various possible futures. The temporal displacement varied, suggesting that it might be accessing different points along my personal timeline. To test this theory, I started making deliberate changes to my routine and appearance, then watching to see if the mirror's reflection would adjust accordingly. If I decided to change my shirt, would the mirror show me wearing the new shirt before I actually changed? If I planned to move a piece of furniture, would the mirror show the room with the furniture in its new position? The results were inconsistent but fascinating. Sometimes the mirror seemed to anticipate my decisions, showing changes before I implemented them. Other times, it appeared to show outcomes that never actually occurred, as if it was displaying possible futures that I ultimately chose not to pursue. The most unsettling experience happened on a Tuesday morning in late July. I was standing in front of the mirror, drinking coffee and reviewing my notes, when I saw something in the reflection that made my blood run cold. Behind my reflected self, I could see another person in the room. It was a man I didn't recognize, standing near the kitchen doorway. He appeared to be middle-aged, wearing dark clothing, and he was watching me intently. I spun around immediately, but the room was empty. I was completely alone in the cabin, just as I had been all morning. But when I looked back at the mirror, the man was still there in the reflection, still watching. I grabbed my camera and tried to photograph the mirror's reflection, but the images came out showing only my own reflection against the empty room. Whatever the mirror was showing me, it couldn't be captured by conventional recording equipment. The man in the mirror remained visible for about 10 minutes, during which time I tried to communicate with him. I waved, pointed, even spoke directly to the mirror, but he showed no response. He simply stood there, observing as if I was the one who was just a reflection. After he disappeared, I spent hours trying to rationalize what I had seen. The most logical explanation was that the mirror was showing me a future in which someone would visit the cabin. But days passed, then weeks, and no one matching the man's description ever appeared. I began to consider more disturbing possibilities. What if the mirror wasn't showing my future, but someone else's present? What if I was somehow looking into a parallel reality, or a different timeline entirely? The man appeared several more times over the following weeks, always in the same location, always watching. Sometimes he would be there for just a few minutes, other times for nearly an hour. I started keeping a log of his appearances, looking for patterns in timing or duration. I also began noticing other anomalies in the mirror's reflection. Sometimes the room would appear to be lit differently, as if the sun was coming from a different direction. Occasionally, I would see objects in the background that didn't exist in the actual room, furniture or decorations that seemed to belong to a different version of the cabin. The most disturbing incident occurred during my last week at the cabin. I was packing my belongings, preparing to return to Berkeley, when I looked into the mirror and saw myself unpacking the same items. My reflection was taking clothes out of suitcases and placing them in drawers, as if I was moving into the cabin rather than leaving it. I watched this reverse process for several minutes, fascinated and horrified. My reflected self seemed completely unaware of my presence, focused entirely on the unpacking task. The movements were natural and purposeful, not like a recording playing in reverse, but like a genuine scene of someone settling into a new home. When I finally left the cabin, I decided to take the mirror with me. I couldn't leave it behind, not after everything I had witnessed. I needed to continue studying it under more controlled conditions. The mirror now sits in my home office, covered by a sheet when I'm not actively observing it. I've been documenting its behavior for over a year now, and the temporal displacement effects continue. If anything, they seem to be becoming more pronounced. I've shown my research to several colleagues, but without the ability to record the anomalous reflections, I have no objective proof of what I'm seeing. Most of my peers assume I'm experiencing some kind of psychological episode brought on by grief over my father's death. But I know what I'm seeing is real. The mirror is somehow accessing information from outside our normal temporal framework. Whether it's showing the future, parallel realities, or something else entirely, I can't say for certain. What I can say is that it's changed how I think about the nature of time and reality. As a quantum physicist, I'm familiar with theories about multiple dimensions and parallel universes, but I never expected to encounter direct evidence of such phenomena. The man still appears occasionally, always in the same location, always watching. I've started to wonder if he's seeing me in his mirror, just as I'm seeing him in mine. Are we looking at each other across some kind of dimensional barrier, each thinking the other is just a reflection? I continue to study the mirror, documenting every anomaly, every temporal displacement, every impossible reflection. I don't know if I'll ever understand how it works or where it came from, but I can't stop looking. The glimpses it provides into other times and realities are too fascinating to ignore. Sometimes I wonder if my father knew what he was bringing home that day 15 years ago. Did he experience the same phenomena I'm seeing now? Is that why he kept it hidden in the shed, away from the rest of the family? I may never know the answers to these questions, but I'll keep searching. The mirror has shown me that reality is far stranger and more complex than I ever imagined, and as a scientist, I can't turn away from that revelation, no matter how disturbing it might be. Story 4. The radio that played tomorrow's news. Hey there, name's Bobby Hutchins and I drive long-haul trucks for a living. Been on the road for about 30 years now, seen pretty much everything you can see from behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. But what happened to me last winter on Interstate 80 between Reno and Salt Lake City? That was something I ain't never experienced before and probably never will again. I was hauling a load of electronics from California to Denver, running about 6 hours behind schedule because of weather delays. It was one of those brutal winter storms that come down from Canada and just sit on the mountain passes for days. Snow, ice, wind that'll knock you sideways if you're not careful. I'd been driving since 4 in the morning, and it was getting close to midnight when I decided I needed to find a place to pull over and get some rest. The truck stops were all packed with drivers waiting out the storm, so I was looking for any safe spot to park for a few hours. About 20 miles east of Elko, Nevada, I saw what looked like an abandoned gas station with a big enough lot to accommodate my rig. The place was dark and obviously hadn't been in business for years, but the pavement was solid and there was enough room to park without blocking the highway. I pulled in and shut down the engine. The storm was still raging pretty good, wind howling around the cab and snow piling up against the windows. I had about 8 hours before I needed to be back on the road, so I figured I'd try to get some sleep. I keep an old AM/FM radio in my cab for times like this when I can't sleep. Sometimes listening to late-night talk shows or whatever music I can pick up helps me relax. I turned it on and started scanning through the stations, looking for something that wasn't just static. Most of what I was getting was the usual stuff you hear in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. A few country music stations from Salt Lake City, some religious programming, a lot of static. But when I got to around 820 on the AM dial, I picked up something strange. It was a news broadcast, which wasn't unusual by itself. Lots of stations run news programming all night, but the stories they were reporting didn't make sense. They were talking about events that I was pretty sure hadn't happened yet. The first story I caught was about a major earthquake in Los Angeles. The newscaster said it had hit at 2:15 that afternoon, measured 7.4 on the Richter scale, and caused significant damage to several freeways. But I had been listening to news stations all day during my drive, and there hadn't been any earthquake in LA. I figured maybe I had missed something, or maybe it was old news being repeated. But then they started talking about a plane crash at Denver International Airport that had supposedly happened that evening. Flight 427 from Phoenix to Chicago had skidded off the runway during landing, injuring 12 passengers. This got my attention because I was scheduled to deliver my load to a warehouse near Denver the next day. I had been monitoring weather and traffic conditions for that area all week, and there hadn't been any reports of airport incidents. The news broadcast continued for about 30 minutes, covering what seemed like a full day's worth of stories. There was a chemical spill in Houston, a bank robbery in Detroit, a factory fire in Portland, all reported as if they had already happened, complete with casualty numbers and official statements from authorities. But the really weird part was when they started giving sports scores. They announced the results of basketball games that I knew were scheduled for the next day. Teams that hadn't played yet according to my schedule, but the radio was reporting final scores as if the games had already finished. I started taking notes, writing down the scores and details they were giving. I figured I could check them against the actual results when the games were played. If the radio was somehow picking up broadcasts from the future, the scores should match. The broadcast ended around 1 in the morning and the station went back to static. I tried adjusting the tuning to see if I could pick it up again, but all I got was the usual mix of distant stations and white noise. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about what I had heard and trying to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of test broadcast or a radio drama that I had misunderstood. Maybe the storm was causing weird atmospheric conditions that let me pick up signals from faraway places where those events had actually happened. But the next morning, when I checked the news on my phone, there was no mention of any earthquake in Los Angeles, no plane crash in Denver, none of the other incidents the radio had reported. Everything seemed normal, just like it had been the day before. I got back on the road and continued toward Denver, but I kept the radio tuned to 820 AM, hoping to pick up that station again. All I got was static and occasional fragments of normal programming from distant stations. That evening, when I was unloading my cargo in Denver, I decided to check the sports scores from the games that had been played that day. I pulled out my notes from the radio broadcast and compared them to the actual results. Every single score matched exactly. The radio had somehow broadcast the correct results of games that hadn't been played yet when I heard the broadcast. Teams that had won according to the radio had indeed won in real life, and the final scores were identical down to the point. I was pretty shaken up by this. I've been driving trucks for 3 decades, and I've heard plenty of strange things on the radio late at night. Weird music, bizarre talk shows, stations that seem to come from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. But I'd never heard anything that seemed to be reporting actual future events with perfect accuracy. Over the next few weeks, I made a point of driving through that area whenever my routes took me in that direction. I would stop at the same abandoned gas station and tune my radio to 820 AM, hoping to pick up that mysterious news broadcast again. It took about a month, but I finally heard it again. Same type of broadcast, same professional-sounding newscaster, but covering different stories. This time they were reporting on a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma, a train derailment in Ohio, and a major stock market drop that had supposedly happened that day. Again, none of these events had actually occurred when I heard the broadcast, but over the next 24 hours, every single story came true. The tornado outbreak hit Oklahoma exactly as described, the train derailed in Ohio with the same number of cars and same type of cargo, and the stock market dropped by the exact percentage the radio had reported. I started keeping a detailed log of these broadcasts. Over the course of 6 months, I managed to pick up the station about once every 3 or 4 weeks. Always in the same location, always around the same time of night, always reporting events that would happen within the next day or two. The accuracy was perfect. Weather disasters, accidents, political developments, sports results, even smaller local news stories. Whatever that radio station was broadcasting, it was somehow accessing information about future events with complete precision. I tried telling other drivers about it, but most of them just laughed it off or suggested I was hearing things. A few guys said they'd try tuning to that frequency when they were in the area, but none of them ever picked up anything unusual. I started to wonder if there was something specific about my radio that allowed it to receive these broadcasts. It's an old Motorola unit from the 1980s that I bought at a truck stop in Missouri about 15 years ago. Nothing special about it as far as I know, but maybe it has some kind of sensitivity to unusual signals. Or maybe it's something about that particular location. The abandoned gas station sits in a valley between two mountain ridges, which might create some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that allows radio waves to behave strangely. I've heard of places where geography can cause weird effects on radio reception. The most disturbing broadcast I heard was in early spring. The newscaster reported on what they called a major transportation incident involving multiple commercial vehicles on Interstate 80 near the Nevada-Utah border. They said it had happened during a severe weather event and resulted in several fatalities. The description was vague, but something about it made me think they might be talking about the exact stretch of highway where I was parked. The timing, the weather conditions, the mention of commercial vehicles, it all seemed to fit too closely to be coincidental. I got out of there immediately, didn't even finish listening to the broadcast. I drove straight through to Salt Lake City without stopping, checking news reports constantly to see if anything had happened behind me. Nothing was reported that night or the next day. But about a week later, there was indeed a major accident on that section of Interstate 80. A sudden spring blizzard had caused multiple trucks to lose control, resulting in a chain reaction collision that killed 4 people and injured dozens more. I wasn't involved because I had left the area immediately after hearing the broadcast. But I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had ignored the warning and stayed parked there. Would I have been caught up in that accident? Was the radio somehow trying to warn me about dangers I might face? Since then, I've been more careful about how I respond to these broadcasts. If I hear anything that might affect my route or schedule, I make changes accordingly. I've altered my driving times, taken different roads, even canceled loads when the broadcast suggested there might be problems ahead. It's hard to explain to dispatchers and customers why I'm suddenly changing plans based on radio broadcasts that they can't hear and that report events that haven't happened yet. I've had to come up with creative excuses about mechanical problems or weather concerns. But I figure it's better to seem unreliable than to ignore warnings about potential disasters. The radio has never been wrong about anything it's reported, so I have to assume it's equally accurate when it describes accidents or other dangers. I still don't understand how any of this is possible. How can a radio station broadcast news about events that haven't happened yet? Where are these signals coming from? Why can only I seem to receive them? I've done some research on time travel theories and parallel universes and all that science fiction stuff, but I'm just a truck driver, not a physicist. I don't have the education to understand the technical explanations for how information might travel backward through time. All I know is what I've experienced. About once a month, when conditions are right, I can tune into a radio station that reports tomorrow's news with perfect accuracy. It's changed how I plan my routes and how I think about the nature of time itself. Sometimes I wonder if there are other people out there who can pick up similar broadcasts. Maybe there are radio signals carrying information from the future all around us, but most people's equipment isn't sensitive enough to detect them. Or maybe most people just dismiss what they hear as imagination or equipment malfunction. I'm getting close to retirement age now, and I've been thinking about what I'll do with this knowledge when I'm no longer driving long-haul routes. Part of me wants to go back to that abandoned gas station with better recording equipment and try to document these broadcasts more systematically. But another part of me thinks maybe some mysteries are better left alone. I've been using the information to keep myself safe on the road, and that seems like enough. I don't need to understand how it works or prove it to anyone else. The radio is still in my cab, and I still tune to 820 AM whenever I'm in that area late at night. Sometimes I pick up the broadcast, sometimes I don't. But when I do hear that familiar newscaster's voice reporting on tomorrow's events, I listen carefully and adjust my plans accordingly. It's a strange way to live, making decisions based on news reports from the future. But after 30 years of driving these highways, I've learned to pay attention when something unusual happens. The road is dangerous enough without ignoring warnings, even if those warnings come from sources I don't understand. Story 5. The camera that photographed ghosts. My grandmother always said I had a gift for seeing things others couldn't, but I never believed her until I inherited her old camera. I'm Maria Santos, I'm 34 years old, and I work as a freelance photographer in San Antonio, Texas. What I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago, and it's completely changed how I see the world around me. Abuela Rosa passed away last December after a long battle with cancer. She was 92 and had lived in the same small house on the west side of San Antonio her entire married life. When my family was cleaning out her belongings, I found an old camera in a wooden box at the back of her bedroom closet. It was a Polaroid camera from the 1970s, the kind that prints photos instantly. The camera itself was in surprisingly good condition, with only minor scratches on the metal body. Inside the box were several packs of film, also old but still sealed in their original packaging. My Aunt Carmen told me that Abuela had bought the camera new in 1976 and used it constantly for years, taking pictures of family gatherings, holidays, and everyday life around the house. But sometime in the early 2000s, she had stopped using it completely and stored it away. When I asked why she had stopped taking pictures, my aunt just shrugged and said Abuela had claimed the camera was broken. She said it wasn't capturing what she wanted it to capture anymore, just strange shadows and blurry shapes that made no sense. I decided to take the camera home and see if I could get it working again. As a professional photographer, I have experience with vintage equipment, and I thought it might be fun to experiment with instant film again. The first roll of film I loaded was one of the packs I had found with the camera. The film was old, probably 15 or 20 years past its expiration date, but I figured I might get some interesting effects from the degraded chemicals. I started by taking simple test shots around my apartment. A picture of my cat sleeping on the couch, a shot of my kitchen table with some flowers, a photo of the view from my living room window. The camera seemed to be working fine mechanically, and the photos developed normally, though with the faded colors and soft focus you'd expect from expired film. But when I looked closely at the developed photos, I noticed something strange. In each picture, there were faint shapes and shadows that I hadn't seen when I took the shot. They were subtle, almost transparent, like double exposures or light leaks, but they seemed to have form and structure. In the photo of my cat, there was what looked like the outline of a person sitting in the chair next to the couch. In the kitchen shot, there was a shadowy figure standing near the refrigerator. The window photo showed what appeared to be faces looking in from outside. Even though I live on the third floor of my building, I initially assumed these were just artifacts from the old film or problems with the camera's light seals. Vintage cameras often develop issues that cause unexpected images to appear in photographs. But the shapes were too consistent and detailed to be random light leaks. I decided to test the camera more systematically. I took it to various locations around San Antonio and photographed ordinary scenes, paying careful attention to what I was seeing through the viewfinder versus what appeared in the developed photos. The results were fascinating and disturbing. Every single photograph contained additional elements that I hadn't observed when taking the shot. People who weren't there, objects that didn't exist, shadows that fell in impossible directions. At the San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park, I photographed the old stone church at Mission San Jose. When the photo developed, it showed the church as I had seen it, but also revealed what looked like dozens of people in period clothing standing around the building. Men in rough work clothes, women in long dresses, children playing in the courtyard. The figures were translucent, like they were made of mist, but their details were clear enough that I could make out individual faces and clothing. They appeared to be from different time periods, spanning centuries of the mission's history. I took the photo to a local historian who specializes in the Spanish colonial period. When I showed her the image, she went completely pale. She said the clothing and hairstyles I had captured were historically accurate for various periods from the 1700s through the early 1900s. More disturbing was her reaction to some of the faces in the photo. She said several of them resembled people from historical records of the mission, including a priest who had died in 1812 and a family who had lived there in the mid-1800s. I began visiting other historical locations around the city, always bringing Abuela's camera. The results were consistent. Every photograph revealed layers of history invisible to the naked eye, showing people and events from the past as if they were still occurring in the present. At the Alamo, the camera captured images of soldiers in both Mexican and Texan uniforms, some appearing to be in the middle of battle. At the old courthouse downtown, I photographed what seemed to be trials and proceedings from decades past, with lawyers and judges in period clothing arguing cases in empty courtrooms. The most unsettling experience happened when I took the camera to Brackenridge Park. I was photographing the old pavilion near the river when I noticed movement in the viewfinder that I couldn't see with my naked eyes. Through the camera's lens, the park was full of activity. Families having picnics, children playing games, couples walking hand in hand. But when I looked up from the camera, the park appeared empty except for a few joggers and dog walkers. The people I was seeing through the viewfinder were dressed in clothing from various decades, suggesting I was somehow observing multiple time periods simultaneously. I took several photos of the scene, and when they developed, they showed exactly what I had seen through the viewfinder. Layers upon layers of human activity, all occurring in the same physical space but separated by years or decades. I started researching the history of Brackenridge Park and discovered that it had been a popular recreation area for over a century. The activities I had photographed matched historical accounts of how the park had been used during different eras. This made me wonder if the camera was somehow capturing residual energy or impressions left behind by past events. I had heard theories about places retaining memories of significant emotional experiences, and perhaps the camera was sensitive enough to detect and record these invisible traces. I decided to test this theory by visiting locations where I knew traumatic events had occurred. I was careful to be respectful and not to intrude on private property or disturb any ongoing investigations. At the site of a car accident that had happened 5 years earlier, the camera captured images of the crash as if it were still happening. I could see the damaged vehicles, emergency responders, and even what appeared to be the victims, though their faces were too blurry to make out clearly. At a house where a murder had occurred decades ago, the photographs showed scenes of violence that were disturbing enough that I stopped taking pictures and left immediately. The camera seemed to be recording not just the presence of past events, but their emotional intensity as well. I began to understand why Abuela had stopped using the camera. Seeing constant reminders of death, tragedy, and loss would be overwhelming for anyone, especially someone in their 80s who had already experienced plenty of grief in their lifetime. But I also started to see the positive potential in what the camera could do. At locations where happy events had occurred, it captured images of celebrations, weddings, family gatherings, and moments of joy that had somehow been preserved in the fabric of those places. I photographed my own childhood home and saw myself as a little girl playing in the backyard with my brothers and sisters. I could see birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and summer barbecues that had happened decades ago but were still somehow present in that space. The most emotional experience was when I took the camera to Abuela's old house, which my family had sold after her death. The new owners had already moved in and were renovating, but they gave me permission to take a few photos for sentimental reasons. Every room in the house was filled with images from Abuela's life. I could see her as a young woman cooking in the kitchen, as a mother caring for her children, as a grandmother hosting family gatherings. Decades of memories were layered throughout the house like transparent films. In her bedroom, I captured an image that brought tears to my eyes. It showed Abuela in her final days, lying in her bed, but she wasn't alone. The room was filled with figures that I recognized as family members who had died before her. Her husband, her parents, siblings, and friends all gathered around her bed as if welcoming her home. I realized that the camera wasn't just showing me the past, it was revealing the connections between all times and all people who had shared these spaces. Death wasn't an ending but a transition, and the love and memories people left behind continued to exist in ways we couldn't normally perceive. I've continued using Abuela's camera, but more selectively now. I focus on locations and situations where I feel the information it reveals might be helpful or healing. I've helped families understand the history of their homes, assisted historians with research projects, and even provided closure for people dealing with loss. The camera has taught me that time isn't linear like we usually think. Past, present, and future seem to exist simultaneously, separated only by our limited perception. The people we've lost aren't really gone. They're just existing in a different layer of reality that we can't normally access. I've tried to find information about where Abuela bought the camera or who manufactured it, but I haven't had any luck. The brand markings are worn off, and it doesn't match any Polaroid models I can find in vintage camera guides. It's possible that it was modified or customized in some way, though I can't imagine what kind of modification would produce these effects. I've also experimented with different types of film to see if the phenomenon is related to the specific film stock Abuela had stored with the camera. I've tried modern Polaroid film, expired film from other sources, and even some experimental films, but none of them produce the same results. Whatever makes this camera special seems to be built into the device itself. Sometimes I wonder if Abuela knew what she was giving me when she left me the camera. Did she understand that I would be able to see and handle what it revealed better than she could? Was this her way of passing on a responsibility or a gift that she could no longer bear? I think about her words about me having a gift for seeing things others couldn't. Maybe she recognized something in me that I hadn't recognized in myself. Maybe the camera doesn't work the same way for everyone who uses it. I've been careful not to share the camera with others or to publicize what it can do. I'm afraid that if word got out, it would either be dismissed as fraud or attract the wrong kind of attention from people who might want to exploit its capabilities. For now, I'm content to use it quietly, helping people when I can and learning more about the hidden layers of reality that exist all around us. The camera has shown me that death is not the end of our story and that love and memory have a power that transcends time and space. Every time I look through the viewfinder, I'm reminded that we're all part of something much larger and more connected than we usually realize. The past is still with us, the future is already beginning, and the present moment contains all of time within it. Story 6. The phone that answered itself. Listen, I know how this is going to sound, but I swear every word of this is true. My name is Tommy Kellerman and I'm 15 years old. I live with my mom in a trailer park outside Amarillo, Texas. And what happened to me last month is the weirdest thing that's ever happened to anyone I know. It started when my mom's boyfriend Rick moved in with us. Rick's not a bad guy, but he's got this habit of bringing home junk that he thinks is valuable. He works at a salvage yard and he's always finding stuff that people have thrown away or that came from car accidents and estate sales. Most of the time it's just broken electronics or old tools that don't work anymore. But sometimes he finds something interesting, like the time he brought home that vintage guitar that turned out to be worth like $300. Anyway, about 6 weeks ago Rick came home with this old cordless phone. It was one of those chunky ones from the 1990s, beige plastic with a long antenna and a base station that plugged into the wall. The kind of phone that probably cost a fortune when it was new but you can't give away nowadays because everyone has cell phones. Rick said he found it in a box of electronics that came from an old lady's house after she died. Her family had donated a bunch of stuff to charity, but some of it ended up at the salvage yard instead. He thought maybe we could use it as a backup phone since our landline had been disconnected for months and Mom's cell phone service gets cut off sometimes when she can't pay the bill. I didn't think much about it at first. We plugged it in and it seemed to work fine. The battery charged up and we got a dial tone when we picked up the handset. Mom called her sister to test it and the call went through normally. But that first night, something weird happened. I was in my room doing homework when I heard the phone ring. It was around 10:30, which was pretty late for anyone to be calling us. I figured it was probably Mom's sister calling back, or maybe someone with a wrong number. The phone rang 4 times, then stopped. Nobody answered it because Mom was already asleep and Rick was watching TV with headphones on. But about 10 minutes later, I heard voices coming from the living room where we kept the phone. I thought maybe Rick had answered it after all and was talking to someone, but when I went to check, Rick was still in his chair with his headphones on, watching some action movie. The phone was sitting on the coffee table and the handset was still in its base, but I could clearly hear 2 people having a conversation. The voices were coming from the phone's speaker, but they were really quiet, like they were far away or talking through a bad connection. I picked up the handset to see if someone was on the line, but all I got was a dial tone. Yet I could still hear the voices coming from the base unit. I listened for a few minutes, trying to figure out what they were saying. It sounded like 2 women talking about everyday stuff, grocery shopping and doctor appointments and what they were going to watch on TV. Normal conversation, but I couldn't understand why it was coming through our phone when nobody had called. I figured it was probably some kind of interference or crossed wires. I've heard that old cordless phones sometimes pick up signals from other phones or even radio broadcasts. So I just unplugged the phone and went back to my room. But the next night, the same thing happened. The phone rang several times around the same time, nobody answered, and then I started hearing voices from the speaker. This time it sounded like a man and a woman, and they seemed to be arguing about something. I tried to listen more carefully to see if I could make out what they were saying. The man sounded frustrated and kept raising his voice, while the woman was trying to calm him down. They mentioned names that I didn't recognize and talked about places I'd never heard of. Over the next week, this became a regular thing. Every night around 10:30, the phone would ring a few times, then start broadcasting these conversations. Sometimes it was the same voices I'd heard before, sometimes it was completely different people. I started keeping track of what I heard, writing down details in a notebook. The conversations seemed to be happening in real time, not recordings or anything like that. People would mention current events, talk about the weather, discuss plans for the next day. But the weird part was that the things they talked about didn't match what was actually happening in our area. They'd mention snow when it was 70 degrees outside, or talk about local businesses and streets that didn't exist in Amarillo. After about 2 weeks of this, I decided to tell Mom what was happening. She didn't believe me at first, thought I was making it up or maybe picking up some kind of radio show. But I convinced her to sit with me one night and listen. Sure enough, around 10:30 the phone started broadcasting another conversation. This time it was 3 people, sounded like a family discussing their plans for someone's birthday party. Mom heard it too and got really freaked out. She wanted to get rid of the phone immediately, said it was probably broken or haunted or something. But I was curious about what was causing it, so I convinced her to let me experiment with it for a few more days. I tried different things to see if I could figure out where the voices were coming from. I moved the phone to different rooms, tried different power outlets, even took it outside to see if the location made a difference. The conversations continued no matter where I put it. I also tried interacting with the voices. When I heard people talking, I would try speaking into the handset or even just talking out loud near the phone. But they never seemed to hear me or respond to anything I said. The conversations were always completely normal, everyday stuff that any family or group of friends might discuss. Nothing dramatic or mysterious, just regular people living their regular lives. But they were definitely not coming from anyone in our area. I started paying closer attention to the details they mentioned, trying to piece together where these people might be located. They talked about local businesses, weather conditions, and events that didn't match anything happening in Texas. One night I heard a woman mention that she needed to pick up her kids from school early because of a snowstorm warning. She said the school district had announced they were closing at noon, but it was mid-October and we hadn't had any snow, not even in the forecast. Another time I heard a man talking about going to something called Murphy's Hardware to buy supplies for a fence repair project. He mentioned that it was right next to the old movie theater on Main Street. But there's no Murphy's Hardware in Amarillo, and our Main Street doesn't have a movie theater. I started to think that maybe the phone was somehow picking up conversations from people in a different city, maybe even a different state. But that didn't explain why the signal was so clear and consistent or why it only happened at the same time every night. Then I had a really strange thought. What if the phone wasn't picking up conversations from a different place, but from a different time? What if somehow the phone was receiving signals from the past or the future? I know that sounds crazy, but the more I listened, the more it seemed possible. The people I was hearing talked about things in a way that seemed slightly off, like they were from a different era. They mentioned TV shows I'd never heard of, talked about prices for things that seemed too low, used expressions that sounded old-fashioned. I tried to research the phone to see if I could find any information about who had owned it before or where it came from. Rick didn't remember much about the estate sale where he found it, just that it was an old lady who had lived alone and died in her sleep. I managed to find out that the woman's name was Margaret Henley, and she had lived in the same house for over 40 years before she passed away. I looked her up online and found her obituary, which mentioned that she had been a retired telephone operator who worked for the phone company for 30 years. That got me thinking. If she had worked for the phone company her whole career, maybe she knew something about phones that other people didn't. Maybe she had modified this phone somehow, or maybe her job had given her access to equipment that could do unusual things. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of just listening to the conversations, I started trying to record them. I used my phone to make audio recordings while the voices were coming through the old cordless phone. But when I played back the recordings, they were completely silent. Even though I could clearly hear voices coming from the phone while I was recording, nothing showed up in the audio files. It was like the conversations existed in a way that normal recording equipment couldn't detect. This made me think that maybe the phenomenon was somehow connected to the specific phone, or maybe even to me personally. Maybe not everyone could hear the voices, just like not everyone could record them. I tested this theory by having Mom and Rick listen to the phone at the same time I was listening. We all heard the same conversations, so it wasn't just in my head. But when I tried to call my friend Derek and have him listen over the phone, he couldn't hear anything unusual. The conversations continued every night for about a month. I got to know some of the regular voices, started to recognize the people who talked most often. There was an elderly couple who seemed to call each other every night to check in. There was a family with teenage kids who were always discussing school and sports activities. But then something changed. One night, instead of the usual conversations, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a woman crying, talking to someone about how scared she was. She kept saying that something was wrong, that people were disappearing, that she didn't know what to do. The conversation was fragmentary, like I was only hearing one side of it. But from what I could piece together, it sounded like she was describing some kind of emergency or disaster. She mentioned that the phones weren't working properly, that she couldn't reach her family, that the authorities weren't responding to calls for help. Over the next few nights, the conversations became increasingly disturbing. Instead of normal everyday chatter, I was hearing people talking about missing persons, power outages, and strange phenomena they couldn't explain. They sounded frightened and confused, like their normal world was falling apart. The last conversation I heard was the most unsettling. It was the elderly man I had been hearing regularly for weeks, but he sounded different, panicked. He was talking to his wife, telling her to pack a bag, that they needed to leave immediately. He said something about lights in the sky and people acting strangely. Then the line went dead. Not just quiet, but completely silent, like the phone had been disconnected. I tried adjusting the volume and checking the connections, but I never heard another conversation after that night. The phone still works normally for regular calls, but it never broadcasts those mysterious conversations anymore. Whatever window it had opened into those other lives seems to have closed permanently. I've thought a lot about what I experienced over those weeks. Were those real conversations from real people, or was the phone somehow generating artificial voices? If they were real, where were those people located? And when were those conversations taking place? The timing of the last conversations with people talking about emergencies and disappearances makes me wonder if I was somehow listening to people during some kind of crisis. Maybe the phone was picking up communications from a disaster area, or maybe from a different timeline where things had gone wrong. I've kept the phone, even though it doesn't do anything unusual anymore. Sometimes I still listen to it late at night, hoping to hear those voices again. I want to know what happened to those people, whether they made it through whatever crisis they were facing. Mom thinks I should just forget about it, says it was probably just some kind of electronic malfunction that I misunderstood. But I know what I heard, and I know it was real. Those were real people living real lives, even if I don't understand how their voices reached me through that old phone. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret Henley, the woman who owned the phone before us, had heard the same conversations. Maybe that's why she kept the phone all those years after cordless phones became obsolete. Maybe she was listening to voices from another time or place, just like I was. I wish I could have asked her about it, could have found out what she knew about the phone's capabilities. But all I have now are questions and the memory of those voices, talking and laughing and crying in the darkness, sharing their lives with someone they never knew was listening. Story 7. The computer that showed other worlds. Dr. Patricia Mills here. I'm a software engineer and computer science professor at MIT, and I need to document what happened to me before I lose my nerve or convince myself it was all some kind of elaborate hallucination. What I experienced challenges everything I understand about computing reality and the nature of existence itself. This began 3 months ago when I inherited my uncle's estate. Uncle Walter was my father's older brother, a brilliant but eccentric man who spent his career working for various technology companies during the early days of personal computing. He never married, had no children, and lived alone in a cluttered house in Palo Alto that he had bought in 1978. Walter had always been secretive about his work. Even at family gatherings, he would deflect questions about his projects with vague references to proprietary research and non-disclosure agreements. We knew he had worked for companies like Xerox, Apple, and several smaller startups that never became household names, but the details of his contributions remained mysterious. When Walter died of a heart attack last spring, I was surprised to learn that he had left everything to me. We had maintained a cordial relationship over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional emails, but we weren't particularly close. I assumed he chose me as his heir because I was the only family member who shared his interest in technology. The house was exactly what you'd expect from a lifelong computer enthusiast. Every room contained multiple computers, monitors, hard drives, and electronic components in various states of assembly. Some of the equipment was cutting edge, while other pieces were vintage machines from the 1970s and 80s that he had apparently maintained in working condition. I spent several weeks cataloging everything, trying to determine what had historical value, what could be sold, and what should simply be recycled. Most of the computers were standard commercial models that I recognized, but there were also several custom-built machines that appeared to be Walter's own designs. The most intriguing item was in his basement workshop. It was a computer system unlike anything I had ever seen, built into a large wooden cabinet that looked more like a piece of furniture than electronic equipment. The cabinet was approximately 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with a single monitor embedded in the upper section and a keyboard shelf that pulled out from the middle. Inside the cabinet, I could see multiple circuit boards, processors, and memory modules that didn't match any standard computer architecture I was familiar with. The components appeared to be a mixture of commercial parts and custom-designed elements that Walter had created himself. There was no manufacturer's label or model number anywhere on the system. The only identification was a small brass plate mounted near the keyboard that read, Dimensional Interface Terminal, Model 1, W. Mills, 1987. I found a notebook next to the computer filled with Walter's handwritten notes about the system's design and operation. The technical details were far beyond anything that should have been possible in 1987. He described processing capabilities, memory architectures, and interface protocols that wouldn't become standard until decades later. But the most fascinating part of his notes wasn't the technical specifications, it was his description of what the computer was designed to do. According to Walter, the Dimensional Interface Terminal was capable of accessing and displaying information from what he called parallel computational matrices, or alternate versions of reality. His theory, as best I could understand it from his notes, was that every possible outcome of every decision or event creates a separate branch of reality. These parallel worlds exist simultaneously, and under the right conditions, it's possible to observe or even interact with them. The computer was supposedly designed to detect and decode information from these alternate realities, displaying them as if they were websites or databases that could be browsed and explored. Walter claimed that he had spent years refining the system and had successfully accessed hundreds of different versions of our world. As a computer scientist, I was skeptical of these claims. The idea of parallel realities isn't necessarily impossible according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, but the notion that a computer built in the 1980s could access them seemed absurd. But I was curious enough to try powering up the system to see what would happen. I spent several days tracing the wiring and checking the connections to make sure everything was safe. The power requirements were substantial, requiring a dedicated 240-volt circuit that Walter had installed in his basement specifically for this machine. When I finally turned it on, the startup process was unlike anything I had experienced with other computers. Instead of a typical boot sequence with text scrolling across the screen, the monitor displayed a series of complex geometric patterns that shifted and evolved in mesmerizing ways. After about 5 minutes, the patterns resolved into what appeared to be a desktop interface, but with elements that I didn't recognize. Instead of familiar icons for files and applications, the screen showed what looked like a 3-dimensional map of interconnected nodes, each one pulsing with different colors and patterns. Walter's notebook included basic operating instructions. According to his notes, each node on the map represented a different dimensional vector, or alternate reality that could be accessed through the system. To explore a particular reality, I needed to select a node and initiate what he called a dimensional query. I started with a node that was colored similar to the others, but seemed to pulse at a slightly different rate. When I clicked on it, the screen filled with what appeared to be a web browser interface, but displaying content that was subtly different from anything I had ever seen. The first page that loaded looked like a news website, but the headlines described events that I knew hadn't happened in our reality. There were articles about political leaders I didn't recognize, scientific discoveries that hadn't been made, and cultural phenomena that didn't exist in our world. One article described a recent breakthrough in fusion energy that had been achieved by a team of researchers at Stanford University. The technology was apparently being implemented worldwide and had eliminated the need for fossil fuels within the past decade. The article included detailed technical specifications and photographs of fusion reactors that looked far more advanced than anything in our reality. Another article discussed the ongoing colonization of Mars, which had apparently begun in the early 2000s and now included several permanent settlements with thousands of residents. There were interviews with colonists describing their daily lives and challenges of living on another planet. I spent hours browsing through this alternate version of the internet, fascinated by the differences and similarities to our own world. Many of the websites looked familiar, with layouts and designs that were recognizably similar to sites I knew, but the content was completely different. Social media platforms existed but featured different cultural trends and popular figures. News sites covered events that had never happened in our timeline. Even entertainment websites discussed movies, books, and TV shows that didn't exist in our reality, many of which sounded far more interesting than their equivalents in our world. The most unsettling discovery was when I searched for my own name. I found several references to a Patricia Mills who was apparently a successful entrepreneur who had founded a major technology company in the late 1990s. This alternate version of myself had never become an academic, but had instead commercialized several breakthrough innovations in artificial intelligence. There were interviews with this other Patricia Mills describing her work in philosophy, and I was disturbed by how different her personality seemed from my own. She was more aggressive, more business-focused, and apparently had very different values and priorities than I did. Over the following weeks, I explored dozens of different dimensional nodes, each one revealing a reality with its own unique history and characteristics. Some were very similar to our world, with only minor differences in politics, technology, or culture. Others were radically different, showing worlds where history had taken completely different paths. In one reality, the United States had never been formed, and North America remained a collection of independent colonies and indigenous nations. In another, World War II had ended differently, leading to a completely altered geopolitical landscape. Some realities showed worlds where certain scientific discoveries had been made earlier or later, leading to dramatically different technological development. The most fascinating realities were those where the fundamental laws of physics seemed to be slightly different. In one world, gravity was apparently weaker, leading to architectural and transportation systems that would be impossible in our reality. In another, electromagnetic phenomena behaved differently, resulting in completely different approaches to electronics and communication. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found a reality that was almost identical to ours, except for one crucial difference. In this world, I had never inherited Walter's house. Instead, the estate had gone to a distant cousin who had immediately sold everything to a technology company. I was able to access news articles and public records showing that Walter's computer system had been acquired by a major corporation and was being used for what they called strategic planning and risk assessment. The articles suggested that the company was using the interface technology to explore alternate realities and identify potential future developments that affect their business. This raised disturbing questions about the implications of the technology. If corporations or governments gained access to information from alternate realities, they could potentially use that knowledge to manipulate events in our own world. They could anticipate technological developments, predict political changes, or even influence the outcome of major decisions. I began to understand why Walter had kept his work secret. The power to observe alternate realities could be incredibly dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. It could destabilize entire societies or give certain groups unfair advantages over others. But I also realized that I was facing an ethical dilemma. Should I continue using the system for my own research, or should I destroy it to prevent it from being misused? Walter had apparently trusted me with this technology, but he hadn't left any clear instructions about what I should do with it. I decided to continue exploring, but to be more systematic about documenting what I found. I began keeping detailed records of each reality I accessed, noting the differences and similarities to our own world. I hoped that by understanding the patterns and variations, I might gain insights into the fundamental nature of reality itself. One of the most significant discoveries was that consciousness and decision-making seemed to play a crucial role in determining which reality we experience. In realities where I had made different life choices, the entire world had developed differently, as if individual decisions had far-reaching consequences beyond what we normally realize. This suggested that free will and personal responsibility might be even more important than we typically assume. Every choice we make doesn't just affect our own lives, but potentially influences the entire trajectory of reality itself. I also noticed that some realities seemed more stable and persistent than others. Realities that were very similar to our own were easy to access and explore, while more dramatically different realities were harder to connect to and seemed to fade or become inaccessible over time. This made me wonder if there might be natural limits to how much realities can diverge from each other, or if there are forces that tend to pull similar realities together while pushing dissimilar ones apart. After 3 months of exploration, I'm still far from understanding the full implications of what Walter created. The dimensional interface terminal has shown me that reality is far more complex and malleable than I ever imagined, but it has also raised questions that I may never be able to answer. I've decided to continue Walter's work, but with extreme caution. I've moved the computer to a secure location, and I'm being very careful about who I share this information with. The potential for misuse is too great to risk widespread knowledge of the technology. But I also believe that the insights I'm gaining could be valuable for humanity's understanding of consciousness, free will, and the nature of existence itself. If used responsibly, this technology could revolutionize our understanding of physics, philosophy, and what it means to be human. For now, I'm documenting everything I discover, hoping that someday I'll find the wisdom to know what to do with this incredible and terrifying gift that Walter has given me. Every night, I return to the basement and explore new realities, each one showing me possibilities that both inspire and disturb me. The universe is far stranger and more wonderful than any of us realized, and I'm privileged to have this glimpse into its infinite complexity. But with that privilege comes a responsibility that weighs heavily on my conscience, knowing that the choices I make about this technology could affect not just our reality, but countless others as well. Story 8. The Watch That Stopped Time. Name's Frank Kowalski. I'm 68 years old, retired from 35 years working construction in Detroit. Been living alone since my wife Marie passed 4 years ago. What I'm going to tell you happened last autumn, and I still don't know what to make of it. I was cleaning out Marie's jewelry box, something I'd been putting off since she died. Found all kinds of things in there I'd forgotten about. Wedding rings from her first marriage, earrings I'd bought her for anniversaries, a brooch that belonged to her mother. Stuff that had meaning to her but didn't mean much to anyone else now. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old handkerchief, I found a watch I'd never seen before. It was a man's watch, looked expensive, with a heavy gold band and a face that had all kinds of small dials and numbers on it. Wasn't the kind of thing Marie would normally wear, and I couldn't remember her ever mentioning it. The watch was running, which surprised me since it had been sitting in that jewelry box for who knows how long. The time it showed was correct, right down to the minute. I figured it must be one of those automatic watches that wins itself when you move it around. I tried it on and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for my wrist. The band was comfortable and the weight felt good, solid but not too heavy. I decided to wear it for a while. Figured Marie would have liked knowing I was getting some use out of something from her collection. The first few days, nothing unusual happened. The watch kept perfect time and looked good with my regular clothes. I got a few compliments from guys at the coffee shop where I usually spend my mornings. Everyone thought it looked expensive and wondered where I'd gotten it. But after about a week, I started noticing something strange. Sometimes when I looked at the watch, the second hand would seem to slow down or even stop for a moment before continuing normally. At first I thought maybe it was running down or needed to be serviced. Then one morning I was sitting in my kitchen reading the newspaper when I heard a crash outside. Sounded like a car accident right in front of my house. I jumped up to look out the window, and as I did, I glanced at my watch to check the time. The second hand had stopped completely. Not just slowed down, but frozen in place between the 8 and 9. I stared at it for several seconds, wondering if the watch had finally broken, when I realized something else was wrong. Everything outside was perfectly still. I could see a car in the middle of the street, its front end crumpled against a telephone pole, but nothing was moving. The driver was visible through the windshield, but he was motionless like a photograph. Even the smoke that should have been rising from the engine was frozen in place. I looked around my kitchen and noticed that everything there was frozen too. The coffee maker, which had been brewing when I heard the crash, was silent. The stream of coffee that had been pouring into the pot was suspended in midair like a brown icicle. I walked to the front door and opened it. Stepping outside to get a better look at the accident, the air was completely silent, no traffic sounds, no birds, no wind. It was like the entire world had been paused like a video recording. I approached the crash car carefully. The driver was a middle-aged man, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, his eyes wide with shock. But he wasn't moving at all, not even blinking. I waved my hand in front of his face but got no response. I walked around the neighborhood for about 10 minutes, looking at the frozen scene. People were stopped in the middle of walking their dogs. Children were motionless on swings at the playground. Cars were suspended at traffic lights. Everything and everyone except me was completely still. When I looked at my watch again, the second hand was still frozen. But as I watched it, the hand suddenly jumped and began moving normally again. Immediately, the world around me came back to life. The driver of the crashed car started moving, sounds returned. The coffee maker in my kitchen resumed brewing. I hurried back inside, my heart pounding. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the watch, trying to figure out what had just happened. Had I somehow stopped time, or had I been removed from time while everything else continued normally? Over the next few days, I experimented carefully with the watch. I discovered that when I focused intently on the second hand and really concentrated on wanting it to stop, it would freeze. And when it froze, everything around me would stop as well. The effect seemed to last as long as I maintained my concentration. The longest I managed to keep time stopped was about 15 minutes, but the mental effort was exhausting. It felt like trying to hold my breath, a strain that became harder to maintain the longer it went on. During these frozen periods, I could move around freely and interact with objects, but I couldn't affect other people. I could touch them, but they remained perfectly still. I could move their arms or turn their heads, but as soon as time resumed, they would return to whatever position they had been in when time stopped. I started using this ability in small ways. If I was running late for an appointment, I would stop time and take as long as I needed to get ready. If I was in a long line at the grocery store, I would freeze time and walk to the front of the line. But I was careful not to abuse it. Something about the power felt dangerous, like it wasn't meant to be used casually. I had the sense that there might be consequences for interfering with the natural flow of time, even if I couldn't see what those consequences might be. The most useful application was when I witnessed accidents or emergencies. I could stop time, assess the situation, and sometimes move people out of harm's way before allowing time to resume. I prevented several car accidents this way, moving pedestrians away from dangerous situations or adjusting the positions of vehicles to avoid collisions. But I also started noticing side effects from using the watch. After stopping time for extended periods, I would feel disoriented and exhausted. Sometimes I would lose track of how much real time had passed, or I would forget whether certain events had happened before or after I had used the watch. More disturbing were the changes I began to see in my reflection. After using the watch frequently for several weeks, I noticed that I looked older in mirrors than I felt. Not dramatically older, but enough to be noticeable. It was as if the time I spent in the frozen periods was aging me while the rest of the world remained unchanged. I also began to experience what I can only describe as temporal echoes. Sometimes I would see brief glimpses of events that hadn't happened yet, or I would remember conversations that I was sure had taken place, but that other people had no memory of. The most unsettling experience happened when I tried to stop time while I was talking to my neighbor, Mistress Patterson. As the world froze around us, I noticed that she didn't freeze like everyone else. Instead, she turned and looked directly at me with an expression of recognition and concern. "You need to be more careful with that," she said, nodding toward my watch. Time isn't meant to be stopped by amateurs. I was so shocked that I lost my concentration and time resumed immediately. Mistress Patterson continued our previous conversation as if nothing had happened, but I could see in her eyes that she remembered the frozen moment. Later that day, I knocked on her door and asked her about what had happened. She invited me in for tea and explained that she had once owned a similar watch, but had given it up after realizing the dangers it posed. According to Mistress Patterson, the watches were created by a group of scientists in the early 1900s who were experimenting with temporal manipulation. Only a few dozen were ever made, and most had been lost or destroyed over the years. She said that prolonged use of the watches could cause serious damage to both the user and the fabric of time itself. She warned me that every time I stopped time, I was creating small tears in reality that would eventually need to be repaired. The more I used the watch, the larger these tears would become, until eventually they might cause permanent damage to the timeline. Mistress Patterson also explained that the aging effects I had noticed were irreversible. Time spent in the frozen periods was borrowed from my natural lifespan, meaning that I was literally trading years of my life for the ability to manipulate time. She urged me to stop using the watch immediately and suggested that I find a way to destroy it before it caused any more damage. But she also warned me that simply breaking the watch might not be enough, since the temporal energy it contained could be released in unpredictable ways. I've been thinking about her warnings for weeks now, but I haven't been able to bring myself to give up the watch. The power it gives me is intoxicating. and I keep finding situations where I feel justified in using it. Just last week, I used it to prevent a child from running into traffic. The little girl had chased a ball into the street just as a truck was coming around the corner. I stopped time, moved her back to the sidewalk, and rolled the ball away from the road. When time resumed, she never knew how close she had come to being hurt. How can I give up something that allows me to save lives and prevent tragedies? Even if it's costing me years of my own life, isn't that a worthwhile trade? But I'm also starting to see signs of the damage Mistress Patterson warned me about. Sometimes I notice small inconsistencies in the world around me, things that seem out of place or wrong in ways I can't quite explain. People will mention events that I don't remember happening, or I'll find objects in my house that I don't remember buying. The temporal echoes are getting stronger too. I'll have vivid memories of conversations or experiences that other people insist never occurred. Sometimes I'm not sure which version of events is real, the one I remember or the one everyone else remembers. I know I need to make a decision soon about what to do with the watch. Every day I keep it, I'm risking more damage to myself and to reality itself. But the thought of giving up this power, of returning to being just another helpless old man watching the world happen around him, is almost unbearable. Marie always said I had a hero complex, that I wanted to save everyone from everything. Maybe that's what's making this decision so hard. The watch gives me the ability to actually be the hero I always wanted to be, even if it's killing me in the process. I've been carrying the watch in my pocket, instead of wearing it, hoping that will reduce the temptation to use it. But every time I hear sirens or see someone in distress, my hand moves automatically to my pocket. The power is always there, waiting for me to use it, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. Maybe tomorrow I'll take Mistress Patterson's advice and find a way to destroy the watch safely. Or maybe I'll use it one more time to help someone who really needs it. I honestly don't know which choice I'll make, and that uncertainty scares me more than anything else about this whole situation. Time is supposed to move forward at the same pace for everyone, but this watch has shown me that time is more fragile and malleable than any of us realize. I just hope I can find the strength to stop manipulating it before I break something that can't be fixed. Story 9. The television that showed the past. I'm Rebecca Martinez and I'm 41 years old. I work as a social worker in Phoenix and I live alone in a small apartment on the south side of the city. What I'm going to tell you about happened 6 months ago, and it's completely changed how I think about memory, history, and the nature of time itself. I had been looking for a television for my bedroom for months, something small and inexpensive that I could use to watch the news or fall asleep to late-night movies. I don't make much money in social work, so I was checking thrift stores and garage sales, hoping to find a decent used TV at a price I could afford. At an estate sale in an older neighborhood near downtown, I found what seemed like the perfect solution. It was a small television from the 1980s, the kind with a built-in VCR that used to be popular before DVD players became common. The woman running the sale said it had belonged to her elderly mother who had recently passed away. The TV was in excellent condition, clean and well-maintained, with all the original cables and a remote control that still worked. The price was only $25, which seemed like a bargain for something that appeared to be fully functional. I brought it home and set it up on my dresser, plugged it in, and turned it on to test the reception. The picture was surprisingly clear for such an old unit, and I was able to pick up all the local channels without any problems. The VCR also worked perfectly, playing a tape that was still in the machine when I bought it. For the first few weeks I used the television normally, watching evening news and weekend movies. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, just a reliable old TV that happened to be a good deal. But then I started noticing something strange about the programming. Sometimes when I turned on the TV, instead of current shows or news, I would see what appeared to be much older programming. Not reruns or classic shows that stations sometimes broadcast, but content that seemed to be from decades past. The first time this happened, I was channel surfing late one night when I came across what looked like a live news broadcast from the 1960s. The newscaster was reporting on events that I recognized from history books: the Vietnam War, civil rights demonstrations, political developments that had happened long before I was born. But it wasn't a documentary or historical retrospective. The broadcast had the immediate, urgent quality of live news, as if these events were happening in real time. The newscaster spoke about developments as if they were current, referring to future events as possibilities rather than established historical facts. I initially assumed I was watching some kind of specialty programming, maybe a cable channel that recreated historical broadcasts or a student film project. But when I checked the channel guide, it showed that I was tuned to a local station that normally broadcast contemporary programming. Over the next few days, this happened several more times. I would turn on the TV expecting to see current programming, but instead I would find myself watching what appeared to be television from various periods in the past. Sometimes it was news broadcasts, other times it was variety shows, game shows, or dramas that seemed authentic to their respective eras. The content wasn't random either. There seemed to be a pattern based on the history of the house where the TV had been located. I did some research and discovered that the elderly woman who had owned the television had lived in the same house for over 50 years, from the 1960s until her death. The historical programming I was seeing seemed to correspond to events that would have been significant to someone living in that house during those time periods. Local news stories, community events, even personal milestones that would have been important to a family living in that neighborhood. I became fascinated by what I was seeing and started keeping detailed notes about each historical broadcast I encountered. The level of detail was remarkable, far beyond what could be recreated by modern filmmakers or historians. These weren't approximations or interpretations of the past, they seemed to be actual recordings of events as they had originally occurred. But the most intriguing discovery came when I started seeing programming that included people I recognized. In a local news broadcast from 1973, I saw a young woman being interviewed about a community garden project. It took me several minutes to realize that the woman was the same person who had sold me the television, just 40 years younger. This made me wonder if the TV was somehow accessing memories or recordings that were connected to its original owner. Perhaps years of watching television in the same location had created some kind of psychic imprint that the device could now replay. I decided to test this theory by paying more attention to the specific content of the historical broadcasts. If they were based on the memories of the previous owner, they should include details that were personally significant to her, rather than just general historical events. Sure enough, the programming began to include more intimate and personal content. I saw what appeared to be home movies of family gatherings, birthday parties, and holidays that had taken place in the house where the TV had been located. The people in these recordings were clearly the previous owner's family and friends, captured during various stages of their lives. The most emotional content was a series of what seemed to be wedding preparations from the early 1970s. I watched as a young woman, who I now recognized as the TV's previous owner, tried on wedding dresses, met with caterers, and discussed plans with her family. The joy and excitement in these scenes was palpable, and I found myself becoming emotionally invested in events that had happened decades before I was born. But I also began to see more difficult memories. There were arguments between family members, scenes of illness and worry, moments of grief and loss that the family had experienced over the years. The TV seemed to be accessing not just happy memories, but the full spectrum of human experience that had occurred in that house. The most disturbing content was a series of scenes from what appeared to be the final months of the previous owner's life. I watched as she struggled with increasing frailty, received visits from concerned family members, and gradually became more isolated and dependent on others. These scenes were incredibly intimate and personal, showing moments that should have been private. I felt like I was intruding on someone's most vulnerable experiences, witnessing details that were never meant to be shared with strangers. I began to question whether I should continue watching these historical broadcasts. Even though they were fascinating from a historical and psychological perspective, they also felt like a violation of the previous owner's privacy. These were her memories, her family's experiences, and I was accessing them without permission. But I also recognized that what I was seeing might be historically valuable. The level of detail and authenticity in these broadcasts could provide insights into daily life in past decades that historians and researchers would find invaluable. I decided to start recording some of the historical programming, hoping to preserve it for potential future study. But when I tried to use the built-in VCR to record what I was seeing, the recordings came out completely blank. Whatever process was creating these historical broadcasts couldn't be captured by conventional recording equipment. I also tried taking photographs and video recordings of the TV screen using my phone and camera, but these also failed to capture the historical content. The images would show only static or current programming, even when I was clearly seeing historical broadcasts on the screen. This suggested that the phenomenon was somehow connected to my direct observation of the television, rather than being a normal broadcast signal that could be recorded or shared with others. I invited a friend over to watch the TV with me, hoping to get a second opinion on what I was experiencing. But when the historical programming appeared, she couldn't see it. From her perspective, the TV was showing only static or normal contemporary programming. This made me wonder if the ability to see the historical broadcasts was somehow connected to me personally, or if it required some kind of psychic sensitivity that not everyone possessed. I started researching the history of the television itself, trying to find information about its manufacturer and any unusual properties it might have. But I couldn't find any records of TVs with similar capabilities, and the manufacturer's documentation showed it to be a standard consumer electronics device. The breakthrough came when I found the previous owner's personal papers, which her family had donated to a local historical society. Among her belongings were several journals and diaries that documented her life experiences in remarkable detail. When I compared the content of these journals to the historical broadcasts I had been seeing, I found exact correlations. Events, conversations, and experiences that she had written about in her diaries were appearing on the television with perfect accuracy. This confirmed my theory that the TV was somehow accessing her memories, but it also raised new questions about how this was possible. How could a television device store and replay human memories? What kind of technology or phenomenon could create such an effect? I consulted with several experts in electronics, psychology, and paranormal research, but none of them could offer a satisfactory explanation for what I was experiencing. The consensus was that what I was describing should be impossible according to our current understanding of how memory and technology work. But I knew what I was seeing was real, even if I couldn't explain how it was happening. The historical broadcasts continued to appear regularly, showing me decades of one family's life experiences with incredible detail and emotional authenticity. I've continued watching and documenting these broadcasts for 6 months now, and they show no signs of stopping. If anything, they seem to be becoming more frequent and more detailed as time goes on. I've learned more about the previous owner and her family than I know about most of my own relatives. I've watched her children grow up, seen her marriage evolve over decades, witnessed the deaths of her parents and siblings, and experienced the gradual changes in her neighborhood and community. In a strange way, I feel like I've become part of her family, even though we never met. I've shared in their joys and sorrows, their triumphs and failures, their ordinary daily experiences, and their most significant life events. The television has become more than just an electronic device to me. It's a window into the past, a repository of human experience, and a reminder that every life contains countless stories worth preserving and remembering. I don't know how long the historical broadcasts will continue, or what will happen to them when the TV eventually breaks down or wears out. But for now, I feel privileged to be the guardian of these memories, the witness to one family's journey through several decades of American history. Every night, I turn on the television wondering what period of the past I'll visit, what experiences I'll share, what insights I'll gain into the nature of memory and the persistence of human experience. The past isn't really gone, I've learned. It's all still here, waiting for the right conditions to be remembered and relived. Story 10. The Music Box That Played Tomorrow's Songs. Hi, I'm Ashley Chen and I'm 19 years old. I'm a sophomore at University of Texas studying music therapy, and I live in a dorm room that I share with my roommate Jessica. What happened to me last semester is going to sound completely crazy, but I swear it's all true. It started when my grandmother died in October. Grandma Lu was my mom's mother, and she had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan in the 1960s. She was this amazing woman who had worked her whole life to give her family opportunities she never had, and she was especially supportive of my music studies. When we were cleaning out her apartment after the funeral, I found a music box that I had never seen before. It was beautiful, made of dark wood with intricate carvings of flowers and birds on the lid. Inside, the velvet lining was still deep red and soft, and there was a small brass mechanism that looked like it was in perfect condition. My mom said she didn't remember the music box either, which was strange because Grandma Lu had lived in the same apartment for 30 years, and we thought we knew all of her possessions. But there it was, sitting on her dresser like it had always belonged there. When I wound up the mechanism and opened the lid, it played a melody that I didn't recognize. It wasn't a traditional music box song like For Elise or The Entertainer. Instead, it was something that sounded almost contemporary, with a complex melody and rhythm that seemed too sophisticated for a simple music box mechanism. The song was beautiful though, really haunting and emotional. It had this quality that made me want to keep listening to it over and over. I asked my mom if she knew what the song was, but she had never heard it before either. I decided to take the music box back to my dorm room. As a music student, I was curious about the mechanism and the unusual song it played. I thought maybe I could transcribe the melody and try to identify it, or at least learn to play it on piano. For the first few weeks, I would wind up the music box every night before going to sleep. The melody was incredibly soothing and helped me relax after stressful days of classes and studying. Jessica liked it too and said it was the prettiest music box song she had ever heard. But then something weird started happening. About a month after I brought the music box to school, I was listening to a streaming music service when I heard a song that sounded familiar. It took me a few minutes to realize that it was the same melody that my music box played, but arranged as a full pop song with vocals and modern instrumentation. The song was by an artist I had never heard of, and according to the streaming service, it had just been released that week. But I had been listening to that exact melody from my music box for over a month. How could a brand new song be identical to a tune from an old music box? I played the music box version for Jessica and then played the streaming version, and she agreed that they were definitely the same melody. We both thought it was a strange coincidence, but we figured maybe the music box song was based on an older tune that the contemporary artist had also discovered and adapted. But then it happened again. A few weeks later, I heard another song on the radio that was unmistakably the same as one of the melodies from my music box. The music box actually played several different songs depending on how many times you wound it up, and this was one of the variations I had heard dozens of times. Again, the song was listed as a brand new release by a different artist, but I had been listening to that melody for weeks before it appeared on the radio. I started paying closer attention to new music releases, and over the next month, I identified 4 more songs that matched melodies from my music box. All of them were released after I had already been listening to the music box versions, and all of them became popular hits within weeks of their release. This was getting too weird to be a coincidence. I started keeping detailed records of the melodies I heard from the music box, recording them on my phone and noting the dates when I first heard each one. Then I would monitor music streaming services and radio stations to see if any of those melodies appeared as new songs. The pattern was consistent. Every melody that came from my music box would eventually appear as a new popular song, usually within 4 to 8 weeks after I first heard it from the box. The arrangements would be completely different, with modern production, lyrics, and instrumentation, but the core melodies were identical. I realized that my music box was somehow playing songs that hadn't been written yet, or at least hadn't been released yet. It was like having a preview of the future of popular music, delivered through an antique mechanism that should have been playing centuries-old classical pieces. As a music student, this was both fascinating and disturbing. I was witnessing the creative process from a completely impossible perspective, hearing melodies before their creators had apparently conceived them. It raised questions about the nature of creativity and inspiration that I wasn't equipped to answer. I started experimenting with the music box more systematically. I discovered that if I wound it different amounts, or if I opened and closed the lid at specific intervals, I could access different melodies. There seemed to be dozens of songs stored in the mechanism, far more than any normal music box should be able to produce. Some of the melodies were clearly pop songs with the kind of catchy hooks and structures that you'd expect to hear on the radio. Others seemed more experimental or artistic, like they might be from independent artists or alternative genres. A few were completely unlike anything I had heard before, with unusual scales and rhythms that didn't fit conventional Western music patterns. I became obsessed with documenting and analyzing these future songs. I would spend hours each day listening to the music box, transcribing melodies, and trying to predict which ones would become commercial hits. I started a spreadsheet tracking each melody, when I first heard it, and when it eventually appeared as a released song. My prediction accuracy was getting scary good. I could usually tell within a few days of hearing a new melody from the music box whether it would become a major hit or remain more obscure. The catchiest, most commercially appealing melodies almost always became top 40 songs within 2 months. I started to wonder if I could somehow use this information. If I knew what songs were going to be popular before they were released, could I benefit financially from that knowledge? Could I invest in the record labels or streaming services that would profit from these hits? But I also felt conflicted about the ethical implications. If these melodies were truly from the future, was I somehow stealing intellectual property that belonged to artists who hadn't created their songs yet. Was I interfering with the natural creative process by having advanced knowledge of what was supposed to be spontaneous inspiration? The situation became even more complicated when I started recognizing some of the future melodies as being similar to songs I was working on for my own music classes. I was taking a composition course where we had to write original pieces, and I found myself unconsciously incorporating elements from the music box melodies into my own work. When I performed one of my compositions for the class, my professor commented that it had a very contemporary, commercial sound that seemed ahead of its time. He suggested that I consider pursuing popular songwriting rather than classical composition. This made me realize that the music box might be influencing my own creative development in ways I hadn't anticipated. Was I becoming a better songwriter by exposure to future music, or was I just copying melodies that hadn't been written yet? I decided to test this by deliberately writing a song that incorporated one of the music box melodies that hadn't appeared as a commercial release yet. I arranged it as a full pop song with lyrics and recorded a demo version using the music department's equipment. 3 weeks later, a major artist released a song with the exact same melody, but with completely different lyrics and arrangement. The commercial version became a huge hit, while my demo remained unheard except by a few classmates. This experience was both validating and frustrating. It proved that the music box was genuinely predicting future songs, but it also showed that I couldn't simply use that knowledge to launch my own music career. The melodies belonged to their eventual creators, regardless of when I first heard them. I started to think about the broader implications of what I was experiencing. If the music box could predict future songs, what did that say about the nature of creativity and artistic inspiration? Were these melodies always destined to be written, or was the music box somehow influencing their creation? Maybe the relationship between the music box and future songs was more complex than simple prediction. Maybe the act of hearing these melodies in advance was somehow part of the creative process that led to their eventual composition. I began researching the history of the music box, hoping to find clues about where it had come from and how it might have acquired its unusual properties. But I couldn't find any information about its manufacturer or previous owners besides my grandmother. I asked my extended family if anyone knew where Grandma Lou had gotten the music box, but no one remembered ever seeing it before her death. It was as if it had simply appeared in her apartment, waiting for someone to discover it. The most unsettling possibility was that the music box had somehow been intended for me specifically. My grandmother had always been supportive of my musical interests, and she had often said that she hoped I would find success as a musician. Maybe she had somehow acquired or created the music box as a way to help my career, even after her death. But if that was true, it raised questions about whether I should be using the music box at all. Was it fair to other musicians for me to have advanced knowledge of future hits? Was I cheating by having access to melodies that hadn't been written yet? I've been struggling with these questions for months now, and I still don't have clear answers. The music box continues to play new melodies regularly, and those melodies continue to appear as popular songs weeks later. My prediction accuracy is now close to 100% for songs that become major hits. I've started sharing some of my predictions with Jessica and a few other friends, just to have witnesses to what's happening. They're all amazed by the accuracy of my forecasts, and some of them have suggested that I should try to monetize this ability somehow. But I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. The music box feels like a gift, but also like a responsibility. I'm being given access to information that could be valuable, but I'm not sure I'm supposed to use it for personal gain. For now, I'm continuing to document the melodies and track their eventual appearance as commercial songs. I'm treating it as a research project, hoping to understand more about how creativity works and whether the future is fixed or changeable. The music box has changed how I think about music and creativity. Every song I hear now makes me wonder about its origins, whether it was always destined to exist or whether it emerged from a complex web of influences and inspirations that span across time. I don't know how long the music box will continue to work or what will happen when I graduate and leave this dorm room. But for now, I'm grateful for this strange gift that has given me a unique perspective on the creative process and the mysterious ways that art comes into existence. Every night, I wind up the music box and listen to tomorrow's hits, wondering about the artists who will eventually write them and the journeys that will lead them to create these melodies. The future of music is beautiful and full of surprises, and I'm privileged to have this early preview of what's to come.